You ever have that moment when something small, a single knock on your door, tells you your life is about to change, and you know it before you even open it? That knock came on a night when the whole block went dark except for our porch light, the sky grumbling like it knew the trouble it was born to witness. And by the time I opened the door, I already felt like someone had flipped a page in my life, and I couldn't put it back. My name's Jack Mercer, and this is the story of how a perfect little subdivision turned into a war over who gets to decide what community really means. We moved into Redford Glen because it looked easy: manicured lawns, neighbors who waved with both hands, rules you could glance at and keep living. I liked the quiet, my wife liked the gardener's touch, and we both liked believing that people respected boundaries. Boundaries, as it turned out, were negotiable. At least that's what Claire Dalton believed, the HOA president who carried herself like she'd been handed the neighborhood Bible and decided she wrote the footnotes. Claire was polished pearls, mint-condition blazer, a smile that could be warm or sharp depending on who she needed to cut down that week. She'd always been good at convincing people she was saving the neighborhood while she pushed her way forward. The thing that started it all was nothing heroic: a storm, a blown transformer, an entire street under a blanket of night. Our house had a generator because I liked being prepared, not because I wanted to be seen as better than anyone. Mrs. Hensley from across the lane knocked on our door at 2 a.m, soaked and shaking, and asked if she could sit with us until the emergency crews figured out the power. "It's just until they get it back," she said, old and small and trusting the wrong people. And we said yes, because that's what neighbors do. We take care of each other. In the morning, Claire marched over like she'd been keeping watch and found us making coffee in the light of our living room. She tilted her head, looked at Mrs. Hensley, and said, "This is not an appropriate use of a private residence for community gathering. We need to keep things orderly." I laughed, because that's what you do when someone uses the word appropriate, like a weapon. "She's my neighbor," I said. "She needed shelter. No harm done." Claire's smile thinned. "Rules are rules," she said, and there it was, the seed. At first it was the little things. A notice taped to our door about unapproved activity, vague, bureaucratic, and meant to humiliate. Someone keyed the tailgate of my truck and left a sticky note. Considered. People we'd waved to for years started avoiding eye contact. Text messages turned cold, and there were meetings in the cul-de-sac that smelled like alliances being formed. Claire cited covenants, bylaws, legal jargon delivered like a sermon. She framed our kindness as disruption, our refusal to bend as selfishness, and before long other neighbors started to accept her version of the story, because it's easier to follow orders than to ask questions. I guess where I started to get angry wasn't the notices or the whispers, it was the escalation that had a face and a name. One Saturday, a tow truck rolled up at dawn, and they tried to take my wife's car for having improper parking, a technicality Claire had weaponized. I stood in front of the truck, sun in my eyes, and told the driver they could not take it. He shrugged like a man who'd seen better days and said, "Orders, sir." "Whose orders?" I asked. He showed me a list signed by Claire, and you could see the faint fingerprints in the ink where someone had decided comfort and control mattered more than fairness. This is where the second act turns, where you have to decide whether you'll be pushed or whether you'll push back. I started collecting evidence like a nervous man, hoarding receipts, photos of notices, recordings of meetings, neighbors' accounts written down on paper that didn't want to stop shaking. Roberto Hale, an old Marine who lived 2 doors down and kept to himself, gave me a folder of things he'd been too cynical to hand over before. "People forget," he said, "how fast a little power feels like safety." Roberto had that steady clarity, the sort that sees motive and history, and he pointed out the pattern. Claire wasn't enforcing community. She was consolidating authority. She'd persuaded a committee that the neighborhood needed a standard, and standards are how you replace messy democracy with tidy control. There was one confrontation that people still whisper about, the kind of scene you write on the inside of your eyelids when you can't sleep. I printed out the relevant statute, a dry, stupid little paragraph that said an HOA couldn't invade private property or coerce neighbors to comply with demands outside zoning, and I held it up at a public gathering on the green. Claire called me dramatic, pointed her finger like a gavel, and said, "This is about protecting our property values." Someone in the crowd clapped like they'd heard the truth before they'd checked if it was true, and the clapping multiplied until it sounded like approval. Protecting property values sounded like a dove stuffed with iron, and I could feel people choosing which narrative to swallow. Then the late-night march happened, the third act sliding into place like a train you didn't see coming. Claire came with a handful of men, not all of them board members, some just men with flashlights, others with the kind of faces that show up when a leader asks for action and people want to feel valuable. They came to our front yard, flashlights cutting the dark into little knives, and they banged on our teak door like they were claiming the place by making noise. She was angry in a way that wasn't about rules anymore. It was about pissing on someone who'd shown them the lie they'd been living. This house has been galvanizing the neighborhood into disobedience, Claire called into the night, and it came out like a proclamation. What happened next nobody wanted to talk about at first because it felt too close to real fear. One of the men raised a bat like he wanted to redraw a line people had tried to ignore for months, and when you see someone swing a wooden bat at a door that belongs to your family, you stop measuring options and start protecting. I shouldn't be proud of the way my heart turned into a hammer in that moment, but maybe that's what happens when you've been pushed enough and you remember what it's like to be safe. I reached for the pepper spray in the hall, not a gun, not a rifle, just the kind of tool you keep for a dog, and the man miscalculated his swing. The bat slipped, someone shouted. A shot rang out down the street, not at us, not at the door. The sound was a single gunshot that carried like a punctuation mark no one wanted to read. People scattered. Someone called 911, and Claire's face went from defiant to something small and mortal in a single breath. What I learned in the aftermath is that when a community fractures, you don't get a tidy cut. You get splinters everywhere. Police arrived. Cameras blinked. Neighbors who'd refused to take sides before came forward with footage they'd recorded on their phones. And the man with the bat who'd thought intimidation was a weekend sport ended up at the center of an investigation. Claire tried to write it all off as a misunderstanding, but her emails leaked, and they read like someone who thought the rules were tips for how to run other people's lives. There were hearings and mediation and lawyers who smelled like office coffee and the cheap kind of righteousness that costs other people their peace. We lost friends who chose comfort over truth, and we gained people who'd been quietly keeping their own receipts. The HOA held an emergency meeting that turned into a referendum about whether a small group of people should have unchecked authority, and the vote was messy and human and exacting, the kind of civic thing people don't notice until it's the only thing left. Claire lost the presidency, and not because I wanted her to, but because people finally saw the pattern she had stitched into the fabric of neighborhood life. She left with her pearls and a trunk full of justifications, and the silence she left behind was louder than any speech. You don't come out of a thing like that unscarred. My wife and I still check the locks twice, and sometimes at night I hear the echo of a bat against wood, and I get up to see if a shadow is a person or a tree. But there are things we kept, a sense that kindness matters, a registry of who actually shows up when it rains, the fact that we learned how to ask questions when someone tells us for your own good. Roberto rebuilt his fence, and he hangs a little plaque now, simple and crooked, that says, "Neighbors first." He smiles in a way that says he's done with headlines, but not with hope. I don't tell this story to make anyone a hero or a villain. People are messy, and power makes that mess more visible. I tell it because it's a lesson about how small decisions add up, about how keeping order can be a mask for someone who wants to be in charge, and about how each of us decides whether to speak when someone else rewrites the rules. If you take one thing from this, let it be that communities are living things. They breathe from the choices we make for each other, and they rot if we let fear and convenience do the voting. So tell me what you think. Was I right to stand my ground? Did Claire deserve to fall from that little throne she'd built? Drop a comment and tell me whether you think communities need stricter rules or more people willing to ask the hard questions. Share your own neighbor stories if you have them, because the truth is, we all carry a piece of this kind of story, and sometimes talking about it is how we stop it from happening again. If this got under your skin, like and subscribe. And if you want more, tell me what you'd like me to unpack next: power, rules, or the strange little ways people assert control.